Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everyone. Good morning. Welcome. It looks a little bit different today because I am broadcasting from Portmore, Jamaica, in a home here visiting my wife's family. It's a little quiet because everyone else has gone to the beach, and I said no, I have to have class, so I was staying and have class, but I'll join everybody else later. But it's very beautiful down here. I would love coming to Jamaica to visit family, and it's always great. But today's class will also look more familiar than it will different as well. Unfortunately, a lot of the capacity that I have here is different than, of course, back home. So I'm going to play the lecture from last year for today's session. And in the middle, when we have the break, you can ask questions as well. And then I will also introduce some new information, particularly for the second part of class. And that's how we'll go from there. So I'm going to play the first half of the lecture from the last year, because really covering the same information I was going to talk about today, but I don't have all my bells and whistles. I left a lot of my books in Ottawa and even the updated notes that I had. But for the most part, it's the same information. So we'll talk about today ancient Ghana. So I'll mention this, you'll see it's repeated in the recording, not Ghana, the current nation state that we have now, but ancient Ghana, which we should probably start referring to as Ouagadougou, because that's the actual name of the place, was Ouagadougou. We get the term Ghana from an Arab chronicler, an Arab traveler historian who wrote about the place, but instead of calling it Ouagadougou, he referred to it by the name of its ruler, the Ghana. Ghana was a title of the ruler, like Mansa in terms of the Mali Empire, or Pharaoh, if we're talking about, or Pera, if we're talking about ancient Egypt or ancient Kemet. So Ouagadougou is the first place that we're going to be talking about, and then we'll go a little bit further south and we will talk about what was going on in what is now Nigeria around this time period. So again, our class goes from 10,000 BCE to 711. Both of the areas that we'll talk about today, a lot of the major action occurs right around that turn of the Common Era. So when we go from BCE, or before Common Era, into Common Era, a lot of the sculptures and the archaeological information that we have comes from about 1,000 years before that period and maybe 500 years after that period. So we're going from actually, I'll go back a little bit further. Today's session, we will cover roughly 1500 BCE up into 500 CE will be the time period that we'll be discussing, and we'll be focused on West Africa. So I will take your questions. So write down any questions you have or put them in the chat. We'll break in the middle after we talk about ancient Ghana. Then I'll provide you some new information about recent studies of archaeology and archaeobotanical studies in Nigeria. And then we will continue with the lecture. So that's what that's how we'll function today. All right, so let me share this and we will get started.
Ancient history. We're going to be talking about Ghana. We're going to be talking about ancient West Africa. And let me be clear. When we talk about Ghana, I'm not talking about modern day Ghana. This is almost the same conversation we have to have when I talk about Nubia or Ethiopia. Ethiopia during ancient times is what's now Sudan. That was Nubia, that was Kush. It was also called Ethiopia. We're not talking about the modern state of Ethiopia. When I'm talking about Ghana, I'm not talking about the modern state of Ghana, which is further south than what we are talking about. We're talking about Ghana up here. And what's now southern Mauritania, Mali area. This is the Ghana we're talking about, not the Ghana near the Atlantic coast where you see the word Ashanti representing the Ashanti Grand Confederacy. We'll talk about that in the second part of our discourse in November. I think we do, November, yeah. We talk about the Ashanti Grand Confederacy. But we're talking about Ghana, again, around what's modern day Mauritania, modern day Mali. So we're moving down. Again, we started in the Nile Valley, we went up, we talked about Carthage, we talked about Numidia. Now we are coming down and talking about Ghana. One place that I would love to talk about, but we don't have a whole lot of information on, which emerged around the same time as ancient Ghana, were the kingdoms of Takur in what's now Senegal. We got a lot of archaeological evidence that this place, Takur, was incredibly powerful, incredibly rich, and grew rich because of its control of the trade between gold and salt along the Atlantic coast going up into North Africa. The problem is we don't have a lot of written records about this place, and the archaeology is still being uncovered. There's a lot more archaeology to be done in West Africa, particularly West and Central Africa. A lot of archaeology to be done that will fill in the gaps of our history. But I wanted to point that out because that is an empire worth learning about and trying to get as much of the sparse information that we can about this place together, because this is going to shed new light on what was going on the extreme west coast of Africa during this time period. And we're talking about between 500 BCE and 500 CE. So right around that turn into the Common Era where it starts going from zero up. So from 500 BCE to 500 CE is the time period that we're talking about right now. So what else is happening in this time period? A lot of important developments are occurring. One technological and one transportation innovation is occurring in Africa during this time. The earlier one is the development of iron technology. This changes the game. Whenever you pick up a history book, when you're talking about world history, no matter if we're talking about European history or Asian history or African history, whenever civilizations develop iron, it's a game changer, it's a turning point. And historians put a lot of emphasis on this, and for good reason. Now, older scholarship that was tinged with racism, tinged with white superiority, just like other things that we've talked about in this class, made it appear as though iron came into Africa from the outside. That was the old understanding of things, that somewhere in the Near East, Turkey or Mesopotamia, or the Assyrians brought iron into Egypt sometime around the 600 BCEs, when the Assyrians took over Egypt. That's when iron comes into Africa, according to older historical accounts. And then from Egypt, iron dispersed into other parts of Africa. That was the belief, because they said African people couldn't possibly figure out how to create iron on their own. Nothing was further from the truth. Recent archaeological evidence has shown that iron was being produced in the heart of Africa, near the Great Lakes region, near what's now Central African Republic, even some parts of Burkina Faso. There have been iron deposits that were found that shows that Africans were smelting and forging iron as far back as 1000 BCE. 1000 BCE. Africans were smelting and forging iron. And the smelting of iron is a very, very advanced technological technique. You have iron ore, and when you see iron ore, it's covered, it's a rock, and the iron is in it, and you have to separate the pure iron from the rock. And the only way you can do that, you have to produce flames and heat to such a degree, and also add other enzymes. I'm not a chemist, so I'm going to talk a lot about science today. Let me give a disclaimer. I'm not a physical scientist. I was trained as a political scientist. For those of you that are physical scientists, you might be able to add some more to these conversations. But I know the general gist. When you're creating iron ore, you have to have the heat to a certain temperature that it separates the pure iron from the rock. And you have to add another enzyme to that to make this chemical reaction actually take place. To do this, it requires some trial and error, requires some experimentation, and you had to have the things to be able to do it. Number one, you had to have iron ore. The great thing about Africa, the central part of Africa is filled with iron ore. Africa is filled to the brim with iron ore. You can find it, and if you can get the iron ore, you got the basic ingredient. Second thing you need trees, because you need charcoal. You need to cut down the trees, get enough charcoal that you can get the temperatures up to a certain degree that you can start smelting iron. Once you smelt iron, then you can forge tools out of it. So there's the smelting process that's separating the iron from the iron ore. And then there's the forging process where you take the molten iron and you form it into swords. You form it into hoes. You form it into shovels. You form it into all the things that you would need, which makes your life easier. So 1000 BCE, we have evidence of Africans forging iron in Central Africa. So no way it came from the outside. This is one of the things that recent historians have realized, is that human beings all over the world, whether we're talking about farming, whether we're talking about iron production, or many other technological advancements, writing, they did so independently. We no longer have this diffusion argument that some great, usually white people developed this technology and then it spread to the rest of the world. We don't use that model anymore for a lot of these ancient technological advancements. So Africans are smelting iron, and it moved from Central Africa into West Africa that had the same type of ingredients, a lot of iron ore, trees, and people that were able to sit down and figure out how to do this process. But once they figured it out, now not all people in Africa figured it out at the same time, because once iron production was figured out by people, they kept that a secret. It was almost like a state secret, state technology. It's like when the US develops a new military. If you have heard about a new plane or a drone or a new tank, that's already old for the military. If you heard about it, it's old. The military got stuff that you don't even know about yet. I'm actually afraid to think about it. At least that's how they try to set it up, to make you afraid. But they are developing things, and they're research and development, and they keep it a state secret because they don't want the other states to know about these things so that they can't compete. Same thing with iron ore. Iron ore and the blacksmiths that created it, in many societies, they almost became quasi-spiritual figures because of their ability to create iron. Iron became part of the mythos and part of the spirituality of people that were able to create it. You have Ogun among the Yoruba. Ogun is the Orisha of iron and the Orisha of technology and the Orisha of getting obstacles out of your path, because that's what iron does. People that could create iron, they could create iron tools. What could iron tools do? They could help you clear the forest a lot faster than using a stone axe or a bronze axe, because it's sharper, it's more durable. You can cut down more trees at a faster rate. More trees cleared, that's more space for farming. And now you're using iron tools to hoe your rows. So when you're planting, you're using iron tools to do that. In addition, now you have iron-tipped spears, iron arrows, iron swords. So when you go to war with some people that are using stone axes or people that are using bows and arrows made out of animal bone, or people that are using bronze weapons, a bronze weapon versus an iron weapon, you can shatter that thing and you're going to take over more land. So you have a larger population because you have greater food production because you're using iron tools to clear the forest and to grow your food, to help, churn up the earth. So larger population, greater military capability. So iron is helping create larger political units in West Africa at this time period. Folks are moving from just living in one village to clusters of villages to now larger empires with greater diversity in terms of what people are doing. Some people are farmers, some people are pottery makers, some people are blacksmiths, some people are all they do is spirituality. This is how we get, folks that are, priests and priestesses. That's all they do is engage in the spiritual world and talk to ancestors. But now they're able to do that because food production is taken care of. All right, so that's one technological advance that we had during this time period. So again, we're still talking about 500 BCE to 500 CE. It's a 1,000-year period. The second, toward the later end of this period, around 400 CE, now I talked about this last week, the introduction of the camel into Africa. Now this did come to Africa from the outside, the camel. People had been traversing the Sahara Desert, particularly when it was wetter. It's never been completely dry. There have been times where parts of the Sahara have been wetter than they were previously. So people have been moving around the Sahara Desert since human beings emerged in Africa. But it's slow going, particularly when it's in its drier states. If you have a horse, or if you're going by foot, it's very slow. You have to go from oases to oases. You have to know the desert to know where those fertile spots are in the desert. This is what the Amazigh, the Berbers, were really good at. They knew where the oases were, but it took a long time. With the introduction of the camel around the 5th century CE, that made things go a lot faster. The camel became to the Sahara what it's similar to the tractor trailer trucks that we see going up and down the road when you're traveling the highway. That's what the camel was in the Sahara. It turned the Sahara into a highway of resources and ideas that not only took goods from the Sahara to the Sahel, but also from the Sahara into Western Asia and connected the world. These camels were the trucks of their time. So iron production and the introduction of the camel into Africa changed the game for these two kingdoms, the kingdom of Takor in what's now Senegal, and then the kingdom that we're going to spend most of our time today talking about, the kingdom of Ghana. And these kingdoms, stretching from Takor in the west all the way over actually to Aksum in the east, are all along this corridor that we call the Sahel. The Sahel, which is actually an Arab word that means the shore, the Sahel. This is where the Sahara Desert meets the grass and woodlands of West and Central and East Africa, this long stretch. A lot of kingdoms developed along this area. So the Sahel, as well as the river systems that operated in the Sahel, the Senegal River, as well as the River Niger, when we talk about West Africa, these two river systems led to the growth of these major civilizations, these major kingdoms that operated as the points where trade connected. The gold and copper that's emerging from the south is being traded for the salt that's coming from the north. This is the major trade. First is a trade primarily of agricultural goods for copper. Prior to this time, prior to the iron revolution, copper is one of the main things being traded throughout West Africa. There's a lot of copper. So particularly Takor, they're trading copper, they're trading copper for salt, agricultural goods for salt. Once iron comes into the picture and the camel comes into the picture, gold fields around what's now, where you see Mali did, start to come into play, because the folks from the north, they want gold. So Ghana is in perfect position to take advantage of this trade between the gold fields in the south, and they never let the people from the north know where the gold is. They keep that to themselves, so they're right in the middle. So you want to trade gold? All right, we'll get the gold for you, and then we'll trade it for your salt, because salt was worth its weight in gold back then. Because again, the people in the Sahel and the woodlands area in Africa, they needed salt. They needed salt to preserve their food. You need salt for seasoning. Salt is incredibly important. In the desert, in the northern areas, they have an abundance of it, but they don't have gold. So gold is important for them. And that gold would make its way not just into the Sahara, but into Western Asia. And then when we get the rise of Islam and the Islamic empires that connect the world from as far east as India to as far west as Spain, now we see the world become more connected and even more dependent on West African gold, which we're really going to pick up when we get into our class in November when we talk about Mali. But this is where it begins. So a lot of the information when we talk about Ghana, we talk about the early history of Ghana. You can read it in Michael Gomez's book, African Dominion. He spends a lot of time, this book came out in 2018. He spends a lot of time talking about the archaeological record, because we don't learn, Ghana's not mentioned until really the 900 CE. And this is when Arab chroniclers start writing about, they write these books, these geographies of the world, where they talk about different places of importance in the world, and Ghana is mentioned. It's always connected with gold. Whenever you see Ghana, the next sentence, they're talking about gold. But prior to that, we don't have a lot about the information about the history of Ghana. We only know about it through archaeological records, from pottery left behind, the iron ore, the iron production that we were talking about, charcoal, residue, all these types of things. We can still find and kind of piece together the history based off the written record, a little bit of oral history from people in the region. The folks that were at the heart of Ghana were the Soninke people. And even Ghana is not really the name of the place. The place had a couple of different names. Ouagadougou is one of the names of the place. Ghana is actually the name of the ruler. The king was called the Ghana. But for the Arab chroniclers, they thought the name of the king was the name of the place. That's why we get the name Ghana. But Ghana is really the name of the ruler. The actual name of the territory is Ouagadougou. And so here's where you see it, here, on a better map. This is the territory of the Kingdom of Ghana. Its capital of Kumbi Saleh was there, and you see it's right in between modern-day Mali and southern Mauritania, and probably touched a little bit of Senegal as well. So this is right here in West Africa. The major cities, Walata, Kumbi Saleh, I always mispronounce this, Adagast. I think it's Adagast. You see the Senegal River there. You see Takor to the west, which again, probably emerged before Ghana, but we're still doing the archaeological evidence to reconstruct the history of Takor. But Ghana, we know a lot about. So this is the area that we're talking about. You see the river systems that are operating there. The Soninke, it's believed, were originally fishermen who took advantage of iron production, who took advantage of those camel caravans that are starting to make their way to the southern part of the Sahara. And they're very close to right here, where you say that word, Bure and Bambouk. Bambouk and Bure are the gold fields. This is where the gold is, or was, in West Africa. Ghana would trade with the people coming from the north, the Amazigh, the Berbers, who operated camel caravans, and they would stop right here. And Ghana got rich because it would tax the trade. So they say, if you want gold, all right, we'll get you gold, but we're going to tax it. And you're going to bring in salt. You want to trade salt? We're going to tax that. And we are going to be the entry point to the rest of West Africa. That's what made them incredibly rich. Another thing that made them rich and powerful, the Berbers brought into Ghana horses. And on the savannas and grasslands of Africa, horses became incredibly powerful military tools. So the Ghana, the ruler of Ghana, was able to create a cavalry of 200,000 soldiers on horseback. So Ghana was able to conquer much of this region, and lesser folks were forced to pay tribute to the ruler of Ghana, or else face the wrath of his iron weapons and his 200,000 cavalry soldiers and the like. Go ahead.
Do records say who the ruler of Ghana was?
Not by name. It just says the Ghana or the king. It would probably be difficult. The reason why, the only records that we have are, and let me rephrase that. Later on, when Ghana was pretty much on decline, we get more information. So by the time we get to the late 1000s, the 1100s, going into the 1200s, we start to get more personalized information, particularly with the rise of Mali, the next great empire. But the early history of Ghana, we talk about the 900s, the 800s, we don't have much. Because what we would have is you had, again, one of the earliest records where we see Ghana as a place being recognized comes from the work of Albuquerque, who's based in Spain. Now, he actually doesn't go to Ghana himself. He's relying on the testimony of Berber traders who go throughout the Sahara, and they talk about the places that they visit, and they give accurate accounts of the places that they go. So he writes this book, The Book of Roads and Kingdoms, and he mentions Ghana, but it's only like a paragraph. It's only like a paragraph. But, and this is a good question that you asked, from this paragraph, we can get a lot of information about Ghana. I just want to show, before I get into what it was like, what Ghana was like, or I'm going to say Ghana, but again, I just want to keep reminding people that that's just the colloquial name. Ouagadougou was the name of the actual place, its capital being Kumbi Saleh. This paragraph tells us a lot, but you can see from these maps how all of this was connected. So you have the Kingdom of Ghana here. You see Kumbi Saleh as the capital. You see all the roads that are connecting to the city of Timbuktu. Gao is emerging as a player in the region as well, which is right on the bend of the Niger River. And the Niger River is much like the Nile River, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. It floods every year too. So you can grow a lot of food, you could fish, you can do things. This is another lifeblood river in Africa. So you see all these roads that are connecting West Africa to the north and going northeast all the way to Egypt. So a lot of transportation, a lot of exchange happening in this region. If we zoom out even more, you can see across the Sahel, these great kingdoms that emerge. Kanem Bornu, which emerges around 900 CE and would last all the way up until the 1900s, before it was defeated by France. The Kingdom of Darfur, the Funj kingdom in what's now Sudan, kind of took over from Nubia around this time period, all the way as far east as Aksum. So you see all these the Hausa states all emerge along this corridor. And in fact, this corridor today is one of the more volatile corridors in Africa, the Sahel. There's just been another coup in the past week in Niger, which is right along this corridor. This is where the Sahara meets the grasslands. And when the Sahara advances, whether naturally or unnaturally because of climate change, that causes conflict. It causes religious conflict, it causes social conflict, political conflict. So we're having a lot of that. But the great states that emerged in this area during this time, they also had to deal with climate change. And in fact, a lot of these states were created as a result of that. Because of the drying of the Sahara, the Berber nomads that lived in the region, they start raiding into southern Africa, the further south more, which caused the people to unite. Instead of being a vulnerable small village, these villages would band together to fend off raids coming from the north. And then they would develop iron and they would develop trade, and sooner or later, a great kingdom would emerge, such as the Hausa states, Kanem Bornu, Songhai, Ghana, so on and so forth. So that gives you a sense of how interconnected Africa was. So when we do more archaeological research, when we find more documents, particularly when we get the documents coming out of Merowe, out of Sudan, when we get those documents deciphered, we're going to learn so much more about the interconnectedness of African history. But what about Ghana? So let's talk about al-Bukhari's description of Ghana, because it tells us a lot about this ancient African kingdom. And I'm going to read you a little bit of this, and it's coming out of the History of Africa, 4th edition, the Shillington book that I always reference in this class, chapter 6. So this is what al-Bukhari says about Ghana. The king's residence comprises a palace and conical huts, the whole surrounded by a fence like a wall. Around the royal town are huts and groves of thorn trees, where there live magicians who control their religious rites. These groves, where they keep their idols and bury their kings, are protected by guards who permit no one to enter and find out what goes on in them. So you got to remember, this is written from the perspective of a Muslim. So they're talking about idols and talking about things, but they're talking about this African religious site that's so sacred to the people that they have guards, because that's where their ancestors are buried. That's where things happen spiritually. He said, none of those who belong to the imperial religion may wear tailored garments except for the king himself and the heir presumptive, his sister's son. Now that's very important to African history. It's very important. So what al-Bukhari is saying But just that little tiny sense tells us so much. The son of the king was not the heir apparent. And this is a model that we see throughout West, Central, East, and Southern Africa, even North Africa to some extent. The heirs to thrones of kingdoms usually got that position matrilineally, meaning you had to be related to the royal family through your mother, not your father. This is something that we see throughout Africa, and we can see it in this early period in the Kingdom of Ghana. It was the king's nephew that was going to take over, not the king's son. So the king's sister's son is the heir apparent. It's a very important detail. And we know that this account of Ghana is probably mostly true because there'd be no reason for the Berbers to add that detail in if it wasn't a true account. This is something, again, we witness, we observe this throughout Africa. It's always the king's sister's son that takes over, because we know for a fact that that child is of royal blood. You don't always know if the king's son is actually of royal blood. They didn't have DNA tests back then. Now we know when a woman has a baby, that's her baby. But they say mama's baby, daddy's maybe. You don't know unless you have a DNA test. They didn't have DNA tests back then, so we don't know if it's his father or not. So people didn't want to they didn't want to take no chances with that. So they say you got to be related to the royal family through your mother. He goes on to describe. He says the rest of the people wear wrappers of cotton, silk, or brocade according to their means. So we see that there's some social inequality in Ghana. Some people are just wearing cotton. Some people are walking around in silk. And he gets into it more. He says, most of the men shave their beards, so not a lot of facial hair, and the women shave their heads. The king adorns himself with female ornaments around the neck and arms. So again, this is from the perspective of an Arab. So when he sees this king decked out with bracelets and jewelry, he's like, oh, that's female ornaments. But we know, even black men today, you have a nice little bracelet, a nice gold chain. So you can tell these are African people, how the king is dressed. On his head, he wears gold embroidered caps covered with turbans of the finest cotton. We see this, the more they talk, they're gonna talk about all this gold that this king and his people are wearing. Behind him stand 10 slaves carrying shields and swords mounted with gold. He gives audience to the people for the redressing of grievances in a hut around which are placed 10 horses covered in golden cloth. So even the horses have to wear gold. Even the slaves are carrying gold. On his right are the sons of vassal kings, their heads plaited with gold and wearing costly garments. What does that tell us? That tells us that in the kingdom of Ouagadougou in Ghana, there are vassal kings, meaning kings that owe their allegiance to the Ghana, and he keeps their sons. So on the right hand of the king, there are 10 young men with braids, with gold plaited in their hair. And they are the sons of kings that pay tribute to the king of Ghana. So he keeps their sons, rears them in the royal palace. They are loyal to not only their fathers, but also loyal to the king. And the king knows, as long as I have your son here in my palace, you're not going to revolt against me, or else your son might not make it back home. So we see that. So this short passage is telling us so much about Ghana. On the ground around him are seated his ministers, whilst the governor of the city sits before him. On guard at the door are dogs of fine pedigree, wearing collars adorned with gold and silver. The royal audience is announced by beating of a drum called the daba, made of a long piece of hollowed out wood. When the people have gathered, his co-religionists draw near upon their knees, sprinkling dust upon their heads as a sign of respect. That's another element of African royalty. It's always connected to spirituality as well. So when people come and greet the king, they're not greeting the king just as a political leader. They're greeting the king as a representative of the ancestors. And when you do so, you get down on your knees and you crawl to the king, you sprinkle dust on your head as a sign of respect. That supplication to royalty in that way, we see that throughout West Africa. Even how you address elders in certain places. You don't just go right up to an older person and shake their hand. You stoop low. In some cases, you get completely down to the ground, depending on how much respect the elder is due. before you're recognized and then you can get up and start doing what you need to do. So we see that even as far back, and this was an account from 1067, but these practices probably go back at least hundreds of years before this is actually written. So just from that small account, so one paragraph about this place, we learn so much, and we can connect it to practices that we see throughout West, Central, and East Africa, particularly as when we talk about the Bantu migration next week, as these ideas about statecraft and the connection between spirituality and politics spread throughout Africa. So very important period that we're talking about here. So this is Ghana. We'll talk about what happens with Ghana in November when we talk about the rise of Mali, because one of those vassal kings that we talked about, those kings that were under the control of Ghana, was the small kingdom of Mali. And eventually that small kingdom is going to grow into a large kingdom under the leadership of one Sundiata Keita, but we'll talk about Sundiata in November. So before we go on and talk about the knot culture, let's take a break and I'll answer any questions. Daniel, you can let me know if anything's in the chat or if anyone has any questions.
All right, everyone. So as I mentioned, we'll actually have the Q&A live and not watch the recording. I actually was taking notes myself about what I said last year, because there were some things that I would not have brought up today had I not watched that, including the state known as Takor. And I did see something in the chat, and David, you're right. And it's something that I've been reflecting on even as I was thinking about today's lecture. And definitely starting in the next cycle, I'm not going to refer to Ouagadougou as Ghana as much anymore. And I'm going to refer to the ruler of Ouagadougou as the Ghana, so that we have a better understanding of that terminology. We don't have to keep using king and kingdom in that way, because it's just inaccurate. And there's no sense of continuing the inaccuracy. So I'm going to start out in the next cycle reminding people that when I'm saying Ouagadougou, I'm talking about ancient Ghana. I'll make that very clear. And then anytime I refer to the ruler, I will talk about the Ghana, so that we can get better acquainted with that understanding of the proper terminology. And we don't have to keep, repeating the error. So yeah, that's something that I definitely was reflecting. I was like, I got to change the titles. We're talking about Ouagadougou. We're not talking about the Ghana. We're talking about Ouagadougou. So that's really important. Brother Prince, go ahead.
So just a question around the naming of the current state of Ghana. Any reason why they didn't call it Ouagadougou if that was the original name of the location?
I'm not sure if it was as popular, because, unfortunately, a lot of the historians even then, and this would have been in the late 1950s when independence was on the horizon, they unfortunately learned a lot about Africa from colonial sources, because that's just how we all learned about Africa, and Ghana, when it was discussed, when we talk about Ouagadougou, when it was discussed, it was always referred to as Ghana. The Ouagadougou name, even up until recently, I mean, the past couple of decades, hasn't been used as much, even though it's much more accurate, and it comes really from Soninke sources, Soninke oral sources. But it hasn't yet gotten to the point of popularity of replacing the misnomer, because al-Bakri's narrative was so well dispersed, and then people just have taken onto it, and then it just the inaccuracy is taking on a life of its own. So yeah, that's something that we have to change. But we had in the 50s, when they were thinking of a name to get away from the Gold Coast, and there's some I've heard different accounts of who was actually responsible for the name. Um, I heard it was a group of folks around Nkrumah and others in the uh, United Gold Coast Convention. I've heard it was that. So it's one political party. But then when Nkrumah left the Gold Coast Convention, United Gold Coast Convention, and formed the Convention People's Party, I heard that it came out of that group. So I'm not even really sure which group came up with or decided to adopt the name Ghana as opposed to moving away from the Gold Coast once independence was achieved. But I'll have a better answer for that next week because it's to get the exact who's actually responsible for that. But yeah, that's kind of what happened. But this is something that again, it's one of those things where we have the accurate term and it's a matter of popularizing it. So it's like ancient Egypt. That's why I go back and forth and I say Egypt and Kemet, because I'm afraid sometimes when we get new people on and I'm referring to things and they won't know what I'm saying, so I go back and forth. But yeah, it's a matter of really becoming accurate and using the terms that we need to use. Any other questions about Ghana, about iron development in Africa? Anything, the introduction of the camel, any of those things that we talked about. Again, more research is still being done, more archaeological research is still being done to give us a better understanding of this time period in West Africa and that part of Northwest Africa. And one important thing, so I'm going to move on back into the recorded lecture, but there's something I wanted to bring up before we get into it. Again, for this cycle, I really want to talk about the evidence and talk about the recent studies that have been conducted and the type of, again, what Joe wanted us to do, these polyvalent scientific studies, where you have multiple disciplines looking into African history, not just the typical work of the historian, which is finding a written document and translating it, or finding, listening to an oral presentation and transcribing it, but using archaeology, using botany and genetics and linguistics and all of these tools to reconstruct African history. A really interesting study that come out about the next place that we'll talk about, which is the Nook culture, came out. This one came out in 2022, so about 2 years ago, and it's a really interesting one. And it's out of the Vegetation History and Archaeobotany Journal. So this is the Journal of Vegetation History and Archaeobotany. So these are the folks that go into the archaeological sites and they're not looking for pottery. They're not looking for tools. They're not looking for sculptures. They're looking for seeds and the residue of vegetation and what people were eating and what people were cultivating. And they can help reconstruct the history by these things. And it's this type of work that we need to do when in places that you don't have a written record or the oral history can't go back that far. And I love looking at this one because it tells you with how much you can reconstruct with just a little bitty thing like the residue of pearl millet. So what these scholars figured out, what they were able to do, they were able to collect the remains of pearl millet and pearl millet seeds in this part of central Nigeria. And what they were able to discover, to figure out from where these seeds were located and the fact that they did, or where the residue was located, and the fact that it didn't have the husks on the millet, so meaning that it had already been processed, yet they found so much of it in this one area. They were able to figure out, okay, this must be a place where rituals or great feasts are taking place, because it's not a place where this pearl millet is being processed. It's a place where this pearl millet is being cooked and eaten. So because there's so much of it, what they were able to deduce was people are bringing all of these tons of pearl millet to this one central location and having these feasts. And it must be associated with some particular ritual in the population, because this isn't a site of production, it's a site of consumption. It's really important because you can tell, okay, well, how many people, you can have an estimate of how many people were here, how often would they meet at this place and have this ritual meal. And maybe it was connected to funerals. Unfortunately, I'm in Jamaica. That's not somebody I know, but one of my wife's aunts went to a funeral yesterday. Somebody had passed away, and of course, you know, in our communities, when people pass away, we always get together. We have food, and you know, people consult the families and all of that. So, what the scholars are presenting in this article is they're finding evidence of a place that was repeatedly used for ritual, that tons of food was being brought at periodic times throughout the history of the Nook civilization, and they were using this one particular crop as the main food, the main dish, I guess is the best term, the main dish at this ritual. So they were eating all this pearl millet, engaging in some type of ritual activity. So again, it doesn't tell us everything, no, but it gives us a nice addition to this history that we can say, well, these people were highly organized. And in addition to what we'll talk about in the lecture with nut culture in terms of the artistry that was being produced, you have a highly ritualistic society. You have a society where the government is able to marshal resources, both human and material, from a lot of different places and bring them all together to do different things. There's a high level of cooperation and organization. So again, every class I will bring up one of these articles. And again, this article is very technical. There's a lot of terms that I had to look up, you know, botanical terms that I don't know anything about because I'm not a botanist. I'm not an archaeobotanist. But I just like to point it out to show this is the type of work that we need to do, and that we should encourage young people to get into, that they can use other sciences, chemistry, you know, biology, physics, to help reconstruct history. It's not just about going into a library and writing things or recording oral history. It's about using all of these skills to kind of figure out what we know about our past and what we can reconstruct. So again, just wanted to drop that in. I'm going to put this on our course website if you want to read it again. It's very technical, but if you read the abstract and you read if you go all the way down, because you kind of see it gets really, really technical in a lot of this, but it'll show you images of what they're looking at. Now, you're not going to be able to understand everything in this article, but if you go to the discussion portion, this is kind of where they break down, where they talk about, okay, this is all the science, and this is for the scientists, this is for the people that understand the jargon, this is for everybody else that's just reading this to want to get the information. Here's a discussion where it talks about what this means, what all of this data that they've collected and they've analyzed, what it means. And it's really important that talking about the evidence for this pearl millet being all over West Africa, where it was being stored and harvested, and people coming together to ritually, you know, eat it and also engage in other activities. And they're hypothesizing it was associated with something with a mortuary exercises or funeral exercises, or, you know, getting somebody from this plane of existence to the next one. All right, so I'm going to go back into the lecture, and then we will open it up for final discussion. It starts right about. Oh, Daniel does give a really good answer to something that was asked in terms of the names of some of the Ghanas of Ouagadougou.
It's really important that that was recorded, that we see that this goes a long way back. So that's a good question that you had. I hope I answered it. Any other questions?
There's more questions, but I did want to make a point on one of the questions that was asked earlier with regards to the names of some of the kings.
Go ahead.
We don't have the names of most of the kings of Ouagadougou, but Al-Bakri does give us the name of two. At the
Okay.
time of his writing, the Ghana of Ouagadougou was a man named Tunkamanin, and he says that that his predecessor was a man named Basi. But as far as I'm aware, those are the only two names that we definitively have.
And this is, yeah, Al-Bakari. So this is, again, 1067 when this is happening. And Ghana's been a major power in the region for at least 500 years. At least 500 years up to that point. And then we do get a final king. I mean, well, not a final king, but we get Sumunguru defeats one of the kings of Ouagadougou later on, getting toward the 13th century. But that's during the time of Sundiata, so we'll talk about that then. But thank you for that. I forgot about Tukamina. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for adding that. And you said there's another question?
No, there's not another question.
Oh, okay. But thank you for always, yeah, and I knew you did, because Daniel studied this a lot as well. You can always fill in when I don't know. So let's move a little bit further south. We're going to move to now what's modern day Nigeria. So Nigeria, we did a whole seminar, Daniel and myself, a couple months ago, did a whole seminar on Nigerian history up to, where do we go? We went up to what, 1500, Daniel?
I think we went to 1800.
1800, yeah, around 1800. And we talked about a lot of this information. But Nigeria has been doing a lot in terms of archaeology. And what we're going to talk about with the nut culture, we know all of this through archaeology. And I'm also going to bring in some science, some more science, even though I'm a political science. I know a little bit about science. So I need to go to this board quickly and go back to my old teaching. I'm going to put this board. You know what? I'll put it here for now. So I'm going to have to come to the board. All right. So the knot culture from around 900 BC to 200 BC. And this is another one of those iron producing cultures. And we know about this culture again, archaeology. That's it. There's no written record. We know there's possibly some oral history about the region, but really it's not reliable. It's all archaeology that we know about this knot culture. 900 BCE, they're producing iron. Again, iron is spread around 1000 BC. We see elements of it in near the Great Lakes region throughout Central Africa. The nut culture is producing iron. We know it was a large polity. Nigeria today is the largest, in terms of population, the most populous country in Africa. 1 in 5 Africans is a Nigerian. Nigeria has always been a very populous place, and nut culture, again, very populous. So people are living here, they're engaging in a diversity of activities, and we know that from, again, the archaeological records. We could find what the people were doing, the type of beads that they were creating. Beads are found throughout Africa, and we could tell from these beads the trade networks that existed. We could find beads from Egypt that were in Ghana, beads from Egypt that are in Senegal, beads from Egypt that are in Nigeria. We can find the agricultural tools that they used, and they were iron. So a lot of this was found, but the most striking thing that was found for this culture were these terracotta sculptures, these beautiful terracottas that are dated back to 900 BCE. In order for people to have time to sit and create something like this, you had to have your food production had to be stable. You had to be very secure, so you weren't always at war. You're trading things. We can tell from the composition of the clay that this clay came from many hundreds of kilometers away, meaning it's not just locally produced clay. And it all came from the same, I wouldn't call it a quarry, but the same area where they're getting this clay from. So specialized clay. So in order for that to happen, that means you had to have a strong administrative political system that's able to coordinate all of this. This is not a simple society. It's a very complex society that created these things. Again, more examples of these terracottas. And these terracottas were found by accident. People weren't looking for these terracottas. I think in this part of Nigeria, there was a, what were they mining? I think they were mining tin. They were mining tin, and they were engaged in those mining activities. And through that process, they found these terracottas buried in the ground. And then they found more, and they found more, and they found more. So it was completely by accident. We wouldn't even known this part of African history had it not been for that mining. So we have these beautifully designed terracottas, and they're huge. So carbon-14 dating, and this is where the science comes in, because when we talk about archaeology in Africa, this is the type of work that we need to do, and we need to do more of throughout Africa. There's a couple of problems with why we haven't. One is resources. You know, as an African nation, your main priority isn't archaeology. Your main priority is feeding people and housing people and healthcare. So there's not a lot of funding for archaeology. And the funding that does come from archaeology comes a lot of times from the West. And there's usually Western teams that do it, and they only go to certain places in Africa that they find worthy. Second reason, in a lot of places in Africa, it's, you know, the wilderness has taken over a lot of areas. So unlike Egypt, where it's dry and it's desert, when you have wet trees and stuff, it makes it harder to do archaeology. It's not impossible, but it makes it harder. Third, a lot of these places, people still live. You know, if people find a nice place to live next to a river and they build a community and it's not attacked from the outside and things don't dry up in terms of resources, people are going to stay there. And they're going to build houses on top of communities. And there's people still living there to this day. So if somebody knocks on your door and says, "We like to do an archaeological dig, you know, could you leave your house?" They're like, "No, no, I'm living here." So you have a lot of people that are living on top of history. And, you know, you can't just tell people to move. So there's a lot of reasons why there's obstacles to African archaeology, but that's not to say that it's impossible. And Nigeria is showing that. Also in Nigeria, they're doing a lot of community archaeology, where they're training people in communities to do this type of work so that they can have a greater appreciation for their ancestors and do different things. So there's a lot of youth groups, particularly in Igbo land and other parts of Nigeria, where they're doing this type of archaeology. And
I mean, on that slide, I've heard of like carbon dating, but like, how does it work? What's the science behind it?
I'm gonna tell y'all something. We didn't plan this. It's like, this is not one of those like scripted questions that I can go to the board. And Andrew's just reading my mind. I'm gonna go to the board and talk about that. So thank you. All right. So again, I'm not a scientist. I'm a political scientist, but I can explain carbon-14 dating. So put your mind back to your 10th grade, 11th grade chemistry class, and you learned about atoms. Every atom has an atomic weight, and that atomic weight is the weight of the amount of protons and neutrons in an atom. Carbon is usually carbon-12, meaning carbon has 6 protons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 protons. I'll put the P there for the proton. And 6 neutrons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 neutrons. This is a typical carbon atom. Some atoms become isotopes, meaning they have extra neutrons through different things that happen in nature. Some carbon atoms take on 2 extra neutrons, and they become carbon-14. So it goes from carbon-12 to carbon-14. Carbon-14 is radioactive, and it decays, but it decays at a steady rate. So if we, and everything that is organic has elements, trace elements of carbon-14. Most of the carbon that's in our bodies, or that's in the trees, that's in things that are organic, in wood, it's carbon-12. Like 99% of it is carbon-12, but you do have trace amounts of, this is actually a carbon-13, and then trace amounts of carbon-14. Carbon-14 decays at a rate, a steady rate for about 50,000 years. For about 50,000 years. Let me go to this chart if you can. So, for example, if we look at something like this, this is a wooden pestle and mortar. So if this was around, let's say 1,500 years ago, we found a fragment of it, we can date this, this tool because it's made out of wood. So it once had carbon. Once something dies, that carbon-14 starts to break down, and it breaks down at a steady rate. For 50,000 years, so this much carbon-14 is in the carbon at a certain point, and then as the years pass, 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 30,000 years, 40,000 years, 50,000 years, to the point that there's no more carbon-14. But up until that point, you can test how long something has been dead based off the amount of carbon-14 left in it. So that makes sense? All right, so this is the carbon-14. So after 50,000 years, there's a certain amount. So you could see, if we find this pestle, let's say it's 1,500 years old, we could test it and see, okay, here's the level of carbon-14. That means when this was died, when this tree died and was cut down, or when this person died, this fossil died, this is when they died, because this is how much carbon-14 is left. So it must have died this many thousand years ago. But it's only good up to 50,000 years. After that, you can't tell. But here's the problem with it, and here's one of the problems with that researchers are going to have in the future. People aren't going to be able to use carbon-14 anymore, because carbon-14, the decay in carbon-14 and all this chemical stuff that happens happens naturally. And there's carbon in the atmosphere, and then there's carbon-14. But we've messed up the environment so much that future researchers aren't going to be able to use carbon-14 dating for the stuff that's happening right now and happened in the 20th century, because it's all out of whack because of the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere that's thrown off this calculation. But for things in the past, it's pretty reliable. Yeah.
And like even things past 50,000 years ago, we're going to have to find like new methods.
There are new methods. We're going to talk about those. You're right. See, you're on it.
Future new methods to find out how old we are when we die.
You're on it. So this is just one method to date things. But archaeology has advanced, and we've been able to bring in so many diverse fields of science to help us recreate the African past. And that's what we're going to need to do, because there's so much of African history that we don't know, because written record only goes back so far, the oral history only goes back so far. We're going to have to rely on these multi-method scientific techniques to help recreate the African past as best as we can. So carbon-14 is just one. And carbon-14, like I said, it shows us that this nut culture goes back to at least 1500 BC. This is around Middle Kingdom, ancient Egypt, that this culture existed. Again, same type of system, a river system, this being the River Niger in Nigeria. So what else do we know? These terracottas were crafted sometime closer to the 9th century BCE. Like I mentioned before, all the clay came from a central source, meaning that they weren't just picking up any clay to create these things. People knew, all right, we got to get clay from this riverbank. We're going to section it off. This is going to be the one that we're going to use to create these terracottas. Archaeologists use something called archaeological chemistry, lipid analysis of ceramic pots. Another key tool. So you have a pot. Usually it's a sister, she makes a nice pot that she's going to use to store food. What we're able to do now with science, if that pot is broken and smashed, and I think last year I actually broke a pot to kind of show what it is, it's hard to completely destroy a pot. You got to use an industrial pulverizer to get a pot to dust that you can just blow. When you break a plate, you break a bowl in your house, you think about those pieces that you picked up. Archaeologists can take a piece of that pot. And now with lipid analysis, if there was food on that pot, animal fat, plant fat residue, they can figure out what plants were being eaten, or what animals were being consumed on that piece of pot. That tells us a lot. That tells us about trade. That tells us about the type of cultivation that was happening. That tells us the species of wheat, or the species of sorghum or millet or rice that's being consumed. So the evidence tells us these Africans were eating honey, they were eating okra, the African eggplant, all of this. So another tool that we can use in our toolbook to kind of figure out how African people lived back then, what they were growing, what they were eating, so on and so forth. In this area, iron production started to occur around 400 BCE to keep this society strong, well-fed, well-protected militarily. So very important place. We'll stop there today, because what we're going to talk about next week is the Bantu migration in section 6. how people from around this area, a little bit further east, a little bit further south, made their way from what's now modern day Nigeria, a little bit of Cameroon, to populate the rest of Central, Southern, and East Africa. This is one of the most important migrations in world history. It didn't happen all at one time, fits and starts, but we get a people that we can trace back to a particular point in Africa. And they brought their culture, they brought their philosophy, they brought their way of organizing politically, spiritually, from that area all the way throughout around 2/3 of Africa. 400 languages emerged out of this Bantu language. The Swahili city-states, the kingdoms of Congo, kingdoms even as far south as the Zulu, are all aspects of this Bantu migration. So we're going to talk about that migration, what it means, how they were able to use technology and things, how we map it, the scholars that are working on it. That's what we're going to talk about next week. So we'll stop there for the day. I'll open it up for any questions or comments or concerns that folks may have. We'll turn off the recording and we'll get right into it. David.
All right, everyone. So that was the lesson for today, the lecture. Does anyone have any further questions? David H., go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Leckbetter. I was just wondering, today, folks are backing up their information and all their writing on electronic data files, which require power in order to have access to those files. And I'm just curious, do you know of any institutions or any anywhere or any place that's backing up files physically in case something happens to the technology and folks don't have access?
Yeah, this is we're going to run into some big problems later on. When I was working as a graduate student in the Charles L. Blocks and Afro-American collection at Temple University, and I was doing a lot of work learning how to be an archivist and archiving things. And I went to one presentation, and the very question that you asked was what was on the agenda, because I was working, it was a part of the Temple University library. And the presenter was saying, yeah, we have to start printing things out and saving them and putting them in acid-free folders and stuff, because yeah, we're going to lose tons of information. Like, we think we have a lot now. We think, and yeah, there's more recorded now digitally than ever in human history. Everyone can have an autobiography written about themselves because, well, now people put everything that's going on in their life on social media and everything like that. So that's this. So we have all this. We know where every major person was every day because they posted everything. We no longer need to collect all their correspondence and programs from different places they spoke at and all these things and bring it all together. Now it's all on Instagram or Twitter, or we can look in their email if we have their email passwords and all that. But you're right. The historians and archivists are saying we have to make a more concerted effort to get some of this stuff physically. I know one of the things that folks have been doing at some of the bigger archives, they're saving old technology, and like particularly old technology that matches up and making sure that it remains in a usable condition. What I mean by that is they're saving the computers that can read floppy disks. They're saving the computers that can read 3.5 disks. They're saving all the computers that have the USB drive and all that, so that when we find things that have that type of data on it, it can be used, it can be transferred and be put into different formats and all that. But you're right, that's still not enough, because without power, if we, there is a place for written documents. The reason why we know so much about ancient Aksum is because we have these documents that are written in gears on this paper that still lasts, that ink on ink that is still legible, that we can read and construct. So yeah, we're gonna have to do that. And some archives are making it a point to try to do that as much as possible, with important figures and thinkers and all of that. But yeah, that is a real and present concern among archivists. Or what are we going to do? Or well, not us, we'll all be gone, but in generations from now, to document this time period, what's going to happen and how. Oh, but again, I don't want to be too negative, but the more pressing concern is will we be here by the time we need to access that information the way that we're destroying the earth? So we should focus on some of that too. So if the option is cutting down more trees to make paper to record our history versus planting more trees to preserve the earth, and then I would take the latter, and figure out maybe we could find some other type of way to get it together. But yeah, that is definitely a concern.
Thank you.
Other folks, other questions or announcements, things going on. So next week, I'll still be here, so we'll have the same type of situation. But I think I'll probably be lecturing live. But if something changes, if there's an issue where I can't have it, I will email everyone by everyone registered for this class. I will email by Wednesday to let you know if we're actually going to have class or not. But either way, if we do, it'll still be from here. So the studio is still closed until the 24th. We'll be back in person on the 24th. So again, I want to thank all of you. Please use the course website. You can read those materials, follow along in the Shillington text. And next week, we will talk about the Bantu migrations and the information we know about Southern and East Africa for the time period that we're discussing. So we'll end it there today, everyone. Stay safe, have a great weekend, and we'll talk soon.